If you're worried about who's going to win the presidential election, you're not alone. So what can we do to make the outcomes of these kinds of elections feel less high stakes?
We've become conditioned to understand that politics drives people apart. But it's possible that politics locally can bring people together.
On this episode, we equip you to articulate why re-anchoring ourselves to the constitutional principle of federalism and reining in federal agency power will actually lead to better policy and reduce political tensions. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about federalism, but specifically in the context of everything going on right now with the presidential election. I'm very excited to be joined by one of the foremost national experts on the topic of federalism. His name is Tony Woodlief. He's the Senior Executive Vice President for the State Policy Network, and he's the Senior Fellow for that network's Center for Practical Federalism. He's also the author of the book, I, Citizen, A Blueprint for Reclaiming American Self-Governance. Tony Woodlief, thanks for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Well, thanks for having me here.
And we're also joined in the studio by Bill Duncan. He's our Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow here at Sutherland. And between the two of these gentlemen, we're going to have a great discussion about reminding folks of the power of our system of government here in the United States and why it's a good thing and can hopefully ease some of the tensions this presidential election. So, Bill, thanks for coming back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tony and Bill, the way I want to kick off this conversation is really focusing on, of course, the fact that we're in the middle of a presidential election right now. It already feels contentious. It'll probably continue to be so. It's kind of become the norm in recent election cycles. But I really want us to talk to the folks out there who are stressed or worried about the presidential election. And here's the pitch that I'll start with you, Tony, to get your reaction to. If you are someone out there who's listening who is stressed and worried about the presidential election, if you think that, well, if the other candidate wins, it's going to be disastrous for America. American democracy is in grave threat. There goes the American experiment. If you're on the other side, you're probably thinking the same thing of the other candidate. I've heard people in my circle, friends, family, relatives, people close to me, express that exact sentiment towards Donald Trump, also towards Kamala Harris. And so I want to start with you, Tony, and ask, is it correct to say that if you are stressed about the presidential election, regardless of which side you fall on, that should move you, it should move each of us to be more robust champions of federalism? Because if we can rein in some of the power of the federal government, especially the executive branch, return some of it to the states, that can lessen the stakes for these kinds of big-profile presidential races. Is that right? And if so, what's the case for that? How do we articulate that to folks who are really worried about what's going to happen this November?
Sure. First of all, I think people, they are right to be worried. We're living at a time of unprecedented executive power. I would say going back to 2000, so Bill Clinton was the last president who in some way attempted to at least apologize for having so much power. Yeah, do you remember he said the era of big government is over? He felt like he had to come into Congress and apologize for having such wide aspirations. But since then, presidents from both parties have not been ashamed of power, and they've used it flagrantly in a variety of ways overseas and within our own country in ways that are, I would say, unconstitutional, quite likely illegal in many cases, and if nothing else, certainly against the ethos on which this country was founded, which is self-governance, right? A kind of neighborly cooperation rooted in faith and shared aspirations for our children and those kinds of things. So we should be anxious because not only do presidents now have they've amassed such power, but they're no longer even ashamed of it. In some cases, they even brag about it. Remember Obama saying, well, I have a pen and a phone. I don't even need Congress. So, let's add your name then to the list of dictators who felt the same way. The legislature is just an impediment to my grand plans and superior morality. So it is a problem. And so then we have to ask, well, what could be done about it? And I, for one, don't think that the answer is to find that one virtuous man or woman who can somehow navigate the cesspool of modern presidential politics and win, and then not use the power. Like, I think that's would be a fool's errand. But instead, it's a matter of returning the power where it should, where it was intended to be situated, which is in states and communities, which of course is federalism. And why is that a good thing? I think the main reason is with federalism, I don't have to convince people in Los Angeles to share my pro-life views, right? I don't have to convince people in Fort Worth, Texas, to share my views about the value of a robust, welfare state. I don't need to convince the entire country to let me live in my community with my neighbors the way I would like. I just have to convince my neighbors, and that's all. And so we're able to let communities govern themselves the way they see fit. And we may not like it, which is fine. But we no longer have to be in this existential battle with the rest of the country just to be able to live in our communities the way we see fit. Instead, we figure it out with our neighbors, which actually can bring people closer together, which is one of the things I argue in my book, I, Citizen, that politics, we've become conditioned to understand that politics drives people apart. But it's possible that politics locally can bring people together, because you have to compromise and talk and hear each other out. It doesn't always work that way, but it could. So that, to me, is the brief for federalism. That the alternative is dictatorship, and federalism gives you a chance to live the way you and your neighbors choose to live, and let others live the way they want.
Tony, that it's an incredibly refreshing and hopeful message, and I love the way you described it. That it under a true federalism approach to self-government, I just have to convince my neighbors, my community, that we can figure out the best thing for a particular issue. I want to get to some examples of that, especially because some of the work that you've done at the Center for Practical Federalism that can shed some light on those things and pull Bill in as well and get kind of some local flavor here in Utah. But I want to build on one thing you said real quick, Tony, and the way that I would approach it is to maybe make what might sound like a little bit of a bold claim or being a little bit critical of some folks. So I'll say it and then reel me in as needed. But it strikes me, based on your response, that if people out there are very worried about the outcome of the presidential election because they feel like the wrong team, so to speak, is going to have too much power, that's going to be damaging for America. And then if those people also do not support the idea of strengthening federalism, meaning reducing the power structurally from the federal government, from the executive in particular, then they actually kind of like authoritarianism as long as it's their person in the chair, so to speak. And so is that fair to say? Am I going too far on that? I mean, I'm trying to sort of identify a threshold that we can show people this is your limiting principle. If you don't want the other team to have this level of power, then you should support federalism. But if you want to preserve that power, as long as it's, quote unquote, the right person in office, and you want your team, your person, to be able to be a lot more robust and bold and kind of do whatever they want, as long as that's policy outcomes you want, does that just not mean that people are kind of ignoring the constitutional system in favor of their preferred wins?
The way I think about it is, sure, there are people on both sides of this spectrum or this, unidimensional political scale who like authoritarianism, and they probably don't even apologize for it. I think for the average party voter, which is the minority of registered voters at this point, the majority of registered voters have said they don't like either party. They don't even identify as partisan. But for the party voters, I think you have this conditioning that enables you to forget or not even hear the sort of authoritarian impulses of your candidate, and to remember in great detail all the authoritarianism of the opponent. And in part, that's because we can selectively, choose our news sources and all the other sorts of biases that enter in. And so I think, like my friends who are really staunch Democrats, they would be shocked to hear me rattle off the ways that their current preferred candidate has been very clearly in favor of an unconstitutional administrative state and acted blatantly in former roles and would in this role that she aspires to, blatantly against checks and balances and due process and even fundamental civil rights. They would be shocked. They can't even imagine that I would think such a thing. And I think the same would be true for my MAGA friends. If I rattled off the sort of illegal use of funds and so on under their preferred candidate when he was in office before, they wouldn't even believe me. So I think for the average partisan voter, they don't embrace authoritarianism. I think that in their mind, the other side is authoritarian and my side is the one who's going to stand up for our rights and values. Like, they really drank that Kool-Aid and they mean well. They're just, in my opinion, misled. And then the practical effect of being misled, of going all in on partisanship that way, that they, in effect, in my view, support authoritarianism. They just don't see it.
Bill, I want to bring you in and get your take on this. It's really fascinating what Tony is saying, and maybe to frame the question this way. I mean, number one, obviously, I'd love your kind of general thoughts of federalism is maybe not the only, but an important answer to a lot of the political angst we're feeling these days, but also to Tony's point of folks on the respective partisan teams that might have some blind spots. How would you address that? Essentially, how do we help persuade more people that we should all develop somewhat of a similar baseline of constraining federal authority, of supporting a system of federalism? How do we do that in such a way that people can latch on to that principle, regardless of their political partisan affiliation or preferences? What's the right way to do that?
Well, I'm probably not smart enough to know the answer to that question. In fact, I know I'm not. But luckily, or providentially, I guess I'd say, there is a solution to I think that concern, and that is to limit the ability of people who may either, like Tony said, openly or even just by accident support authoritarians. Limit what they can do. And that limitation, the positive thing is that limitation is already inherent in our political system. The nature of a written constitution specifically is that it says exactly what the federal government is allowed to do and specifies that the things that the federal government is not allowed to do are left to the states and communities and individuals to come up with on their own. So we don't have to kind of create a new way to respond to the problem of overreaching authority. That was the framers knew that would happen, at the outset, and so they created a system in which government is divided not only among the branches of the federal government, but I think more importantly among different local versus national authority. And so so we have a solution. We have a way forward is kind of to push back against that authoritarian impulse by just restricting the range of issues that the federal government gets to decide. And when we do that, then we allow states and communities and families to kind of come up with their own solutions to many of the issues that the federal government feels like that they can and need to weigh in on now. And when we do that, I think we see a lot of other advantages. One of the things I love about Tony's work is that it's the focus on practical. Federalism has real benefits that can be observed in real time, and I think that's a powerful message we need to maybe make a little more clear.
I want to ask about the center you mentioned that Tony runs, the Center for Practical Federalism, but one quick interjection, Bill. It sounds like what you're saying is it's not like we have to engage in some wild radical shift to fix this issue. All we have to do is re-anchor to the Constitution, recommit ourselves to America's founding principles. We recently put out a statement from Sutherland Institute outlining these founding aspirational principles that we should re-anchor ourselves to. But is that right? Is it just as simple as reminding folks of the wisdom of the Constitution and our constitutional system? And is that the answer to this federalism question?
Well, it's definitely an enormous part of the answer. I mean, there are obviously lots of things. Nothing is that simple. We won't just turn away from the system that we've kind of inherited, in a day. But we do have a path to restoring kind of a sane and reasonable approach to making policies about the things that are most important to us. I just think it's always good to remember that this was laid out for us a long time ago, and so we don't have to create, like you say, an entirely new system where we think, oh gosh, how are we going to check the power of the president? How are we going to keep these administrative agencies from overreaching? Well, they were never meant to do that. They never have been allowed, in constitutional terms, to do that. So all we have to do is to come back to the design of the Constitution, and I like your word anchored. If we're anchored to that, then even though it will be a challenge to implement, we at least know how to go about doing that.
Tony, can you shed some light for us, and especially for our listeners, the Center for Practical Federalism? What does it hope to accomplish? And as Bill mentioned, I'll echo this praise for the term practical. It's not the Center for Idealistic, Wish List, Hypothetical, Never Going to Happen Federalism. It's a Center for Practical Federalism, so you're making it real and tangible for people. Tell us about the work you do there and what you hope to accomplish with that center that maybe can address some of these things we're talking about.
Sure. So it began with some simple math. So my state policy network is a nationwide network of state-based organizations that are trying to do their best to get good policy in their states. Sutherland Institute is a member of that network, a proud member of that network. And so what we realized a few years ago was, golly, we have all of our partners getting great things done in state capitals, but it's all going to be undone by federal agencies. They're reaching deeper and deeper into our communities to tell us how to run our schools, our hospitals, our nursing homes. So we've got to do something about that. And so the math was simply, well, gosh, there are 535 members of Congress. They're supposed to oversee these agencies, but for some reason they're not. There's a lot of reasons they're not. They have between them, if we add them all up, maybe 18,000 staffers all in. Some of those are not comms people. They actually are policy people. There's a few of them left. But they're outnumbered because there's 2.1 million civilian federal employees working for who knows how many agencies and sub-agencies. The GAO can't even tell us anymore. So let's say roughly 400. Right, they're outnumbered. And so against that, what we set is a roughly 520,000 elected state and local officials around this country, all of whom have some authority to investigate, object, litigate, obstruct, refuse to comply with illegal federal directives. And so then we thought, well, if we just get 1 or 2% of those guys and gals to just get in the game and start making some legal trouble for these federal agencies, that could make a big difference. And so that was how the Center for Practical Federalism was born, is we began to put together tools for state and local elected officials to show them, look, here are the avenues of power that federal agencies exercise. Here's how they come into state agencies and direct them to change policy, to alter priorities, often without any kind of lawmaker awareness whatsoever. Here's how they issue illegal rulemaking that they pass off as something called guidance. Here's how they use regulation, right, to get what they want, how they use money to get what they want. So we built a set of tools to make lawmakers, state AGs, governors and others, even sheriffs, mayors, make them all aware, if they'll just see, here's how federal agencies are manipulating outcomes in your communities and disrupting the priorities of your people in your state. And then here's what you can do about it. And so if I summed it all up, I would say our goal is to steer state and local elected officials into direct conflict with federal agencies from which they emerge as heroes. And then they go on to inspire other heroes. And that's a very practical endeavor. It's not finding, the one killer lawsuit that will finally persuade the Supreme Court that 90% of what federal agencies do is illegal. That's never going to happen. But there's a heck of a lot you can do at the state and local level to make a lot of trouble for misbehaving federal bureaucrats, especially if we act in concert. And so that's what the center is trying to foment.
Tony, one question that comes to mind is the Chevron case from the Supreme Court recently a good example of the kinds of things that need to happen? And just as a recap for our listeners, we've talked about it previously. Bill here has written about it and spoken about it at length, but the Supreme Court overturned essentially this long-standing legal doctrine called Chevron deference, meaning that courts previous to this ruling would basically defer to federal agencies when there was a question of interpretation of federal law. The practice was, well, we're just going to defer to federal agencies because you guys are the experts, and just basically assume that what you're doing is correct and legal and all those kinds of things. It's probably an inartful summary, and Bill can correct me on that, but that strikes me as something very much in this lane, that the high-level effect of that is going to be putting more responsibility back on Congress to write more clear and specific laws, and also sort of rein in federal agencies a little bit. How do you see that ruling maybe creating the context or the foundation for everything you're talking about? Our state leaders, or rather should state policymakers and leaders feel more confident that their abilities to push back to create better delineation between federal and state governments will be enhanced and strengthened because of the Chevron ruling?
I'm not an attorney. I think there's clearly some restraint that will now have to be exercised by agencies that they did not have to exercise before. I'll tell you, as someone who regularly reads through portions of the Federal Register, which is really gripping, reading. Quite often agencies, if they want to expand their dominion, they don't come right out and say, because of Chevron, we get to do this other stuff too. Instead, they will sort of subtly over years redefine what words mean. And I'll give you just one example, because you're out west. You deal with the various Department of Interior sub-agencies that have wreaked havoc on our environment and our natural resources. So Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service. Collectively, they have pushed for about 20 years to take a clear statutory mandate to conserve the forests, the waters, the habitat. And they have, for 20 years, subtly in handbooks and other documents, and now in a proposed rule that came out last year that we filed a comment against, they propose that conservation also means restoration. That seems like a small thing, and in many contexts, it is kind of the same thing. So, conserve this, room I'm in, take care of it. But, oh, you know what? I got some water damage here on the windowsill. I better restore that because I was supposed to take care of everything. It sounds like it's kind of the same mandate. Restoration then is their opening to throw everybody off of those lands, restrict all use that was statutorily mandated, mining, hiking, touristry, foresting, all this stuff, to end all of it with just subtle change in what the word means. So Chevron doesn't fix that, right? That's still going to take people that are watching them, attorneys that are good, judges that are aware of the law, like all that stuff still has to happen. Those agencies will not stop to manipulate what words mean to do what they want. But Chevron is certainly very helpful. The challenge now, two challenges I'll lay out. One is, you think of Chevron as like one side of a pincer, right? So it says to agencies, you can't just creatively reinterpret the law to do what you want. Well, if that's where we leave it, I promise you, and it doesn't matter what party's in charge, Congress will begin to write laws that give blanket authority to these agencies. If we tell Congress, hey, you can't be vague anymore, they'll say, okay, we're going to let Fish and Wildlife do whatever they want. Hey, go protect the forest. There's your mandate. Do whatever you have to do. They did that with the Department of Energy. That's why your dishwasher barely works, right? And your toilet's hardly flush, and your washing machine, right? Our clothes smell bad. Because Department of Energy has this blanket power given to them by Congress. So the other thing that has to happen now is something called non-delegation, and there's already quick cases that are teed up to tell Congress, you can't just hand over all this authority to these agencies. You have to legislate specifically. So those two things together could be the opening to actual federalism, because Congress will have to then send money to the states, block grant form, give states the power to do these things. So that's one reality, is we've got to win these non-delegation cases. The other is, it's not like a bold prediction, but it's something a lot of people may not be thinking about. Agencies will use guidance illegally much more than they do already. And so very quickly, the way federal law works is if an agency wants to create a regulation, there's a whole process they have to go through. There's notice and comment. There's time for people to weigh in. There's requirements for how to deal with those objections. There's legal avenues if you feel like the agency didn't listen to your objection the way they should. It was all set up so we can evaluate regulation before it becomes final. Now, within that, there's a carve out for something called guidance, which is not a new rule. It's just a clarification of an existing rule. So that if Congress says, hey, you need to keep water in cups, and I'm a regulated party, I can say, well, all the other cups are glass, but this one is plastic. Does this count according to your regulation? And the agency will issue some guidance saying, yes, Tony, plastic also counts as a cup. We're not going to come after you. So that's what guidance is supposed to do. But now what agencies do is they say, well, that regulation that said everybody must have water in cups, that also means that the water needs to be blue, and you need to have a bucket, and you need to also have, some plants over here. They're suddenly clarifying entirely new rules, which is illegal, but they're already doing it. And the reason that's so dangerous is because most lawmakers, most state agency officials don't understand that guidance is not binding. It is simply supposed to be a clarification. You do not have to comply with it. The OMB has been clear about that. There have been federal cases that are clear about that. So those agencies are essentially going to start bluffing more than they already do, because illegal guidance is a bluff. It's the agency saying, well, in my opinion, you have to start doing environmental justice. That's my opinion. And then the implication is, if you don't, we'll take your money. We might come after you and sue you. And so people comply, even though they're not required to by law. So anyway, that's sort of a long discourse, but I think you sum it all up. Chevron is an important win, but it really just changes the playing field, and now we have to play more smartly to win.
Bill, what's your take on that? And I especially want to see if we can tease out some of the examples of where states are doing a better job, where they can do a better job. In this context of Chevron, as Tony mentioned, that it's an important step forward. It's going to be impactful in a significant way, but there's still a lot of work that has to happen at the federal level, at the state level, to, again, sort of re-strengthen our federalism system. What's your take on that? What kind of messages should we be pushing out in pursuit of that objective?
Well, I love what Tony said. I think that's right. And I, as he was describing this sort of the guidance issue, I thought, there's a good example here in Utah of the way that's worked. And people have probably been watching and heard about Title IX, which is a law passed by Congress in the early 1970s to ensure that women were not disadvantaged in higher education. And the current administration, federal administration, has said, well, we read, Title IX to require all of these, new things, ranging from the use of like private facilities in schools, all the way to how they handle disciplinary complaints. So a wide range of things, so some of that is formal and subject to the challenges, but some of it, again, is informal. A lot of what the Department of Education does is in dear colleague letters, they call them, and they'll write to all the school superintendents to say, here's the way we think, you ought to apply these kinds of laws. And but the Utah legislature, seeing this concern developing, has said, well, we're going to push. We're not required to comply with regulations or guidance from the federal government that's not consistent with the statute that Congress passed. And that kind of thing is helpful. And again, like Tony said at the beginning, when a state stands up and says, no, you can't ask us to do that, that's not legal to do that, then hopefully it gives a sense to other states that they can do the same thing. And we hope that kind of thing will happen on a wide range. And public lands would be another example of where a state like Utah, where this is kind of a day-to-day issue, right, in this state, can push back and say, no, you're asking more than is reasonable. And once that happens, hopefully other states will say, good point. Why are we just going along with this? Well, one of the challenges, though, I think there's two challenges. One is that we don't often know what's happening. I mean, I suspect that in a legislature like Utah, with very dedicated legislators who are trying to do a lot, but they also have full-time jobs and families and other responsibilities. Knowing that whole gigantic set of federal regulations and guidance and all of these kinds of things is not easy to do. So I think we could do, one thing we could do is to just be a little more clear about what's being asked of us and kind of provide some transparency to what's happening with federal agencies as they relate to state agencies. But I think the other thing is that we could do a good job of highlighting some of the things that states do really well that national government doesn't necessarily do well. And there's lots of examples of that. In the midst of the Chevron case, as that was all playing out, there was kind of a alarmist concerns that if the federal government agencies are constrained in some way from issuing specific guidance about pollution or whatever, that we're going to live in a world with no protections and environmental degradation. But I think the reality that you can observe on the ground is that states do a great job in many cases of taking care of the environment that they have, of bringing people together to protect natural resources, of coming up with good solutions in their schools. They really don't need that kind of guidance. And so I think we could also do a good job, a better job perhaps of explaining not only that states have the authority to do this, but they're typically going to do a great job, a better job. And even when they don't do a good job, they can serve as a negative example. Other states can avoid the problems that these states have. And we certainly see that happening too.
Tony, from what Bill's saying, another example that comes to mind is some of the reform around safety net welfare policy. There's, of course, the famous welfare reform bill from the 90s that created or at least refined some elements into the system we have today. And those are some significant improvements, in particular getting single mothers better connected with the workforce, reducing child poverty significantly because of a stronger connection to work. And even though that was a federal reform, it was started at the state level. There were states that were trying different things. There were state think tanks working with governors and legislatures that created some momentum to sort of push the federal government in this direction. And maybe a modern example of this is Utah stands out with its system of workforce development and safety net welfare programs in our consolidated model, the one-door model as it's called. And there are now a number of other states that are kind of pleading the federal government to let them try the same thing, give more authority to the states to customize their workforce and welfare efforts along similar lines that Utah has. And Utah's record speaks for itself. We constantly are at the top of rankings for the best economy in the nation, the most diverse economy. We're ranked as the highest state for upward mobility. There are all these things that show that there is a lot of opportunity in Utah. And I think at least a significant portion of that credit is because we've been able to do some of these things. So number one, I want to ask you, are there other policy examples that come to your mind that we can say, yes, these are examples of states doing things really well to sort of show people, yes, if states are allowed to do more, that's going to, on average, be a good thing for Americans and for the residents of those states. And then after that, I want to get into the scorecard from the Center for Practical Federalism as well, because I think it helps give some metrics, some teeth to this question. So one, other policy examples that come to your mind that we should be talking about? Sure.
One that comes to mind just from some other work is forest management. I mean, there's this fascinating, it was a number of tribes went to Congress, I think it was last year or the year before, they testified before, it's like a House subcommittee, let's say, on environment having to do with forestry. And there's this, one of the tribes, it was a Apache tribe in New Mexico. They presented this picture, and what you could see is like a fence line. And on one side is a well-maintained forest. That's the Apache land. And they've taken out the dead trees. Right, there's room to move through and check trees, pull the diseased ones, the fallen ones. It's well-maintained. The other side is Forest Service land, and it's just a tinderbox, right? It's just dead stuff, burned. It's all just sitting there waiting for the spark or the lightning strike. And the Apache were just saying, look, can you make Forest Service clean up at least the land that's next to ours? Because when theirs catches on fire, it gets out of control and it starts to burn ours. And so you have examples like Michigan's a great example, Washington State, where state and local and tribal leaders do a much better job for a lot of reasons. That's just one area. Another that comes to mind is workforce development. States do a better job. I think the feds at some point a few years ago, they tried to have this big expansive workforce development plan, and the data when it came in indicated that you had a better chance of getting a job as a young or unskilled person if you hadn't gone through the federal program than if you had. It actually reduced your odds of getting a job and keeping it. And same thing with apprenticeship programs. States do a much better job. The Department of Labor recently issued an intent to file a regulation that would essentially nationalize apprenticeship programs nationwide, which is just unconscionable because you're talking about the lives of young people trying to get skills. So there's many areas where states and communities do it better. And it shouldn't surprise us because these policies are made by people who actually live there. Right, I'd always rather have my forest policy be set by people who live in and near the forest than ideologues who answer to other ideologues in D.C. who are put in power by other ideologues who don't even live near a forest. So there's plenty of examples like that. And I'm sorry I got on my rant and I forgot the second half of your question. But there's my answer to the first half.
No, rants are great. That's the beauty of podcast discussions. A quick comment in addition to that, Tony, and then I'll get to the second question, which is about the scorecard. But here in Utah, I used to work for our previous governor, Gary Herbert, and I remember working for him. He would say all the time, essentially to the federal government, if you, the federal government, give Utah less money but with fewer strings attached, we will deliver a better product. And it was this anchoring principle of Utah's approach of what we have confidence in our ability of self-government. Just let us do it. And it seems to be a very basic principle that maybe we've strayed away from a little too much as a country. And I think that feeds into the scorecard. So here, you guys at the Center for Practical Federalism put out a scorecard of state-based, so kind of how states are doing with respect to federalism. Utah was ranked number 1, which of course is very exciting for us. We like being number 1 on a good ranking like that. But I want to ask you, number 1, just to explain what is the scorecard? Why is it a helpful tool for policymakers? And maybe some of the things that stood out to you that put Utah at the top of that list.
Sure. So the goal was to try to identify, it wasn't to say this state's better than that state or anything else. It was just to say, think about it like cholesterol. Right? If you have a bad cholesterol score, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to fall over dead tomorrow, but you need to pay attention and maybe change some things because it's a danger sign. And so what we were looking at is, what are some variables that indicate greater vulnerability to federal manipulation, bullying, and influence in states and communities? And so we looked at a combination of variables. Some of the variables we looked at on the surface just have to do with internal state operations. Like how, what authority does the legislature have over, say, its own state agencies? Well, why does that matter for the federal-state relationship? Well, because state agencies are a primary vector of federal influence. And so if you have state agencies that are not accountable to the legislature, that the legislature doesn't have an oversight committee and doesn't do investigations, there's no kind of look-back period for major regulations, the agencies are allowed to lobby the federal government directly with no legislative awareness, then you are setting yourself up for federal agencies to issue regulations or guidance and state agencies to immediately implement it, whether or not it's legal, and lawmakers don't even know. And we see this going on right now in a number of areas. So we looked at those internal variables to see, is the legislature aware and are they in charge? And then we looked at federal variables, like what are the rules that govern how your state receives federal funds? Like in Utah, they do it pretty well. Not as well as, believe it or not, Oregon, which is really darn good at this. But the legislature at least is apprised of state agency intentions to receive federal money. The reason that matters is those grants are written like contracts, and there's fine print, there's strings. And so a number of states, controlled by people who call themselves conservatives, allow unelected state bureaucrats to sign off on those grants and all those strings and obligate the state to future spending and future subservience in a very undemocratic way, right? Unelected people deciding with other unelected people how citizens in a state will live, to me, is the opposite of a republic and the opposite of a democracy. So we were looking at those kinds of variables. Utah did great, which is unsurprising. I mean, in my opinion, And I know Sutherland Institute, you've had a lot of influence over how the state government operates, trying to always push towards greater faithfulness to a set of founding principles. There's more work that could be done, of course, but I mean, Utah is a very well-run state in a number of respects. So I was not surprised to see Utah number one. My friends in Wisconsin would want me to point out, though, that they're right on your heels and they're coming for you in the next edition of the scorecard. So you gotta look out. They want the number one spot.
Well, a little bit of friendly competition between states is a good thing. I mean, that's, again, kind of the point of the system of federalism, is let the states innovate and compete with one another to see who can have the best ideas to a certain respect. Tony, there's just a couple minutes left, and I want to ask you a quick question of just any advice for Utah policymakers, and then after that we'll go to both you and Bill for kind of the final elevator question of just what's a final takeaway for our listeners and for the voters. But first, if governor or legislative leadership, if they're listening to this, looking at the scorecard, what are the top one or two things you would tell our leaders here in Utah that maybe we could improve on in regards to federalism looking forward?
Sure. Well, one is, on our website, you'll find something called a guidance tracker. We try to flag what we believe is potentially illegal guidance, so it's rulemaking disguised as clarification. And if anybody wants to call me, I can give you some examples. Very, very harmful to children. Guidance is being pushed into schools right now and into other programs like 4-H. Very harmful, very dangerous. And we know for a fact that municipalities and school districts are implementing this guidance with lack of awareness by lawmakers, and that has to change. Lawmakers could immediately forbid schools to implement this guidance if they're aware. So one of the things we saw in Tennessee was the legislature requires the State Department of Education to notify them of all federal guidance they receive. And this was after we made the legislature aware that guidance is not law, because they had a very different impression from their own state education bureaucrats. They were told it is the law, and the state had to comply, and that is untrue. So now they are in a position to see that guidance and to intervene if that guidance contradicts state law or violates, honestly, the conscience and morality of the people in the state. And you would be shocked at what some of this guidance is demanding in schools. So that's number one. The other is, I just want to encourage all lawmakers. If you look, especially in a state like Utah in the West, a lot of the statutes that authorize these kind of resource and land governing agencies like Interior, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, those laws very clearly require some consultation with state and local lawmakers, being mindful of inholders and adjacent property owners. Like, they're supposed to cooperate with and defer to, wherever possible, the people who live in the state. We all know they don't. They're so arrogant. So one thing I've been urging lawmakers to do is hold a hearing and subpoena let's say the regional head of Bureau and Land Management or Fish and Wildlife. Now, he won't show up, but also call in all of those stakeholders that federal law requires that agency to cooperate with, and just read into the record. All of them testifying that, no, they never told me what they were going to do. They never asked me if it could be done better. They never checked on it. They broke this law. They broke that law. They trespassed on my property. Read it all in the record, and then send it over to DOJ, the division that's supposed to oversee BLM, and start making some trouble for the fellow running that regional office, right? There is a lot that we could do that, using our brains, we can make trouble for these people who are harming our communities if we're smart about it. So anyway, that's probably a little too detailed, but the main thing is we have authority. Our elected officials have authority to defend us from predatory federal practice, and by golly, they should start doing it.
Well, and that's excellent, Tony, and I think very insightful for our policymakers here in the state. I wish we had more and more time to talk about this. I'm sure we could talk for quite a while. But the final question I want to ask both of you, and maybe start with you, Bill, and then Tony, give you the last word. Is the scenario is you're on an elevator and an average voter walks into the elevator. Then they say, "Hey, Bill Duncan. Hey, Tony Woodlief. I'd seen your guys' work on federalism." If they say either, "I'm really stressed about this election and I'm really worried about the other team getting their person in the White House," how can I be less worried about it? And how can I act as a voter, as a citizen, to make these kinds of things feel less high stakes in the future? And then the second component to that is if you had to convince someone who maybe likes using the federal government to achieve their preferred policy ends, what's the message to persuade them to sort of reel that in and refocus on federalism? So it's a two-part elevator question, which is tough, but I have faith in both of you guys to do it. So, Bill, let's go you first, and then Tony.
Hopefully, I'll give Tony time to think of a great answer, because I'm not sure I have a great one. But I think I would say that it's okay to be concerned about elections. It's an important part of what we do, but we should be as concerned about what's happening with our local lawmakers, that we ought to get close to them and understand what they're doing and encourage them to do more in exactly the ways that Tony's described, in pushing back and in asserting their own authority, and hopefully extend to that person some confidence that that is the constitutional design. And so they don't have to feel that they're acting in some way that's inappropriate. That's exactly the intention. And to the degree we're not promoting the constitutional design to allow states and communities to govern themselves, then we've created the exact situation that's created all these anxieties and worries for us.
Tony, your closing thoughts to your average voter that you bump into. Give them some confidence, give them some talking points, a game plan, and how do we persuade people that federalism is a better approach than just relying on the federal government alone to get your preferred policy goals?
Well, the main thing I try to remind people is the people we see on our screens or weighing in the comments section, these are not average Americans. They do not represent most Americans. Most Americans don't care for either party. They certainly do not care for the current leadership of either party. They don't care for political consultants and hacks and, biased journalists. They're just regular people who love their children like you do. They believe in free enterprise, most of them. They welcome religion, even if they're not religious. They're tolerant. They're kind. They help their neighbors when they can. This country is filled with very good people who don't want to hurt you, and they don't want to be hurt. And it's so easy to forget that, because the people who sell us, information on screens, they make all their money by selling hatred and division. And if we're not careful, we start to think that the picture they're painting of this country is true, and it's a lie. So I just try to remind people, our neighbors are not the problem, right? It's a relatively small number of people who are toxic, they're poisonous, they're deceptive. They're the problem, but there's a lot more of us, And so then what does that mean? If nothing else, get to know your neighbors, right? Get to know the people in your church. Get to know people around you and be reminded how good this country is and what you can do in it, helping your neighbor. So I think that's the first thing, is to not lose hope because of all the garbage that is pushed to us in our screens, because it's a lie. And then for, my friends who are maybe have a little authoritarian streak, I just, along the same vein, I just remind them it's not neighborly. It's just not, it's not Christian, it's not neighborly, it's not democratic. All those things you want to believe about yourself, you're not living up to them if you want to use the power of the federal government to compel all the people around you to live the way you want. And you don't want to be that kind of person. And furthermore, if you're so sure you're right, you ought to be able to convince your neighbors to go along with you. And that's what the whole system was set up to do, is for neighbors to work it out together without using force, right? But through cooperation and kindness and compromise.
That is an excellent note to end on. Thank you, Bill and Tony, for your time. And Tony, all the work that you're doing at the Center for Practical Federalism. This is one of those important issues that I think is easy to gloss over in all of our conversations about politics and policy. There's so many other things that can be sometimes worthy topics of discussion and other times distractions. So I really appreciate what you guys are doing to help shed some light and make it actionable for voters and policymakers. And again, kind of in the words of Bill, to retether ourselves to our constitutional design. So just want to thank you both for your time. Bill Duncan, Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow here at Sutherland, and Tony Woodlief, SPN, Senior Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Center for Practical Federalism. Bill and Tony, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to take one quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there are a few notes that I captured from our conversation that I think we can use as talking points. If we're speaking with somebody who's maybe a little skeptical or critical of the idea of reducing federal power and enhancing what states can do on some of these issues, maybe they're worried about policy outcomes that they care about being affected in a negative way. Here are a few points that I think we can share in those conversations. Number one, we should point out that states are often better equipped than the federal government to solve some of these big policy challenges that we talk about. Great example of that is workforce and welfare policy. Utah is a standout in the nation for its rates of upward mobility, strong economy, lots of economic opportunity in the state, in significant part because we have a unique model that we were able to do at the state level in terms of how we help people get out of poverty, get into work, and move towards self-sufficiency. This is something that a lot of other states are interested in, as we've talked about on previous episodes. Issues like that show that states, if they're given the right flexibility to be innovative on some of these issues, can actually do a really good job, and we can learn from other states, even if they do things that in our own state we wouldn't want to replicate. The second key point is that if we push more authority from the federal government to the states, that's going to have the impact of lessening political tensions and polarization and contempt, and also lead to better policy because it's more closely connected to the people that these policies are impacting. That's going to be a good thing for our policy outcomes and for, again, our overall goal of reducing the feeling of contempt and division that so often plagues our political discussions. And number three, getting to know our neighbors, our city leaders, our state legislators is going to also help, again, lead to better policy and reduce political polarization and tensions and contempt because we're interacting more face-to-face with real people in our communities. And if we're having those kinds of policy conversations in the context of a given state where state legislators are making the decisions that impact those state residents, it goes back to that principle that a government closer to the people can often govern better for those people. So all of this effort is going to help us reduce political tensions, achieve better policy outcomes, and make it so that, again, our national political debates or national elections feel less like a high-stakes existential contest because more of that decision-making is dispersed throughout the country, which is the way the Constitution originally envisioned it. I think if we're able to articulate these things, it'll help promote this idea of federalism, and again, maybe the next election cycle we face will feel a little bit less dire because we've been making some of these changes and having more of these policy discussions and decisions at the state and local level, which will be a good thing in a number of ways for all of us. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. I hope that you've enjoyed what you've heard and that you feel better equipped to defend some of these principles we talked about today. If you want to get more Defending Ideas content, you can subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. You can also subscribe on YouTube at the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And if you do, click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops. You can access all of that and more at defendingideas.org or any of the platforms wherever you like to get your shows. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, in particular if you think there need to be more conversations like this that are articulating these principles in a way to help make them broadly popular to more voters, please consider supporting our work. Head on over to sutherlandinstitute.org/donate and make a contribution today. Again, thanks for your time on this episode of Defending Ideas. That's it for this week's episode from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.